Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Today we're going to discuss sex offences and those who commit them, a subject we've never focused on. That we haven't maybe speaks volumes. Rob Allen and I are joined by two experts, Professor of Forensic Psychology Belinda Winder and Eppie Sprung, who runs the charity Next Chapter Scotland. Eppie, you were convicted of a sexual offence. As a teacher, you had a relationship with a 17-year-old pupil. You're quite unusual in having chosen to be open about your past. Why have you?
Goodness, I suppose there's a few different elements at play. So one of them is that I had absolutely no choice to do anything other than be open about it. I had significant media coverage. I never felt that there would be any opportunity to sort of, hide away. It's not really part of my nature either. And then when I had children, I made the decision to set up Next Chapter Scotland because I felt that if they were going to live with the repercussions of having a parent who had a conviction for a sexual offence particularly, then I wanted them to look at that parent and know that she was turning it into something positive. And that's what I've tried to do ever since, really.
So how does Next Chapter Scotland relate?
So everything about Next Chapter Scotland is about supporting people to navigate the stigma and discrimination that they face because of involvement with the criminal justice system. Before I set up Next Chapter Scotland, I'd lived for 10 years facing the impact of having a criminal record, which is significant, specifically a conviction for a sexual offence, because we know that people with that offence category face the most significant stigma. And so at Next Chapter Scotland, we support people to navigate the challenges that they face. And our role is to kind of walk alongside them, give them the support that they need, the information they need, and advocacy and legal advice where necessary.
So, you've talked about media coverage. It has come after you recently as well as at the time of the case. And you have been kind of vilified for some of your statements and work. Are there people who've been convicted of sexual offences do try and change their name and their identity? Did your being open and this vilification in the tabloids ever make you think, I might follow that road?
Not me, no. But that's not to say that I don't completely understand and appreciate why people do make that decision. I think that for me, hiding away, I would never have been able to live a sort of fulfilling life. The other part of it as well is that I'm very conscious that my particular offence on the spectrum of the type of sexual offences that do exist in the world is one that people are a little bit more open to talking about. And because of that, it puts me in a sort of position of privilege within that group, and I feel a responsibility to do more with that.
So what you're saying is that a teacher who has a relationship and affair with a 17-year-old pupil is more socially acceptable than, say, you'd been convicted of accessing illegal, indecent images.
Yeah, there's an entire spectrum, and obviously there are some incredibly serious sexual offences on that spectrum, and then there are some offences that have less harm attached to them, which are more kind of palatable in society.
Just to kind of say, Eppie's offence is far more palatable, partly as well because she is a female. I think we'd find it quite a different case if she was a male teacher, and the narrative wrapped around that conviction and that offence would have been quite a different one.
Belinda, I think it's fair to say that Eppie's relatively unusual in being so open about it and talking about it. Why do you think that is? Why are most people so reticent about doing that?
There's going to be a few factors here, but one of the first is the sheer hatred, sometimes violence, from the general public towards anyone with a sexual offence. As soon as someone has a sexual conviction, what comes to mind is the worst of the worst tabloid stories that we have read. And we take on a whole load of myths that are really kind of perpetrated by fear, perhaps, or sometimes from the media for sales. But we think of people as almost always being on the lookout to commit another sexual offence, as being likely to offend against anyone, about being without control of themselves. And so we put people into a sort of box where pretty much every hateful and negative characteristic is thrown into the box with them. So having a sexual conviction is actually quite dangerous for people. And it also means that people will go well beyond the law in terms of extending that punishment. I am absolutely for people serving an appropriate punishment, but not one that is administered on an ongoing basis by every member of the public.
Yeah, I mean, this term sex offences does cover an enormous range of behaviour, doesn't it? From people looking at things that they shouldn't on their computer where there's no direct contact through to contact. I mean, is it a useful category even because it covers such a wide range? What do you think, Belinda?
No, the category of sexual offending is very, very broad, and yet we don't see it as broad. So it is really unhelpful, actually.
There's also an element that we often support people with around the way that blanket bans are enforced for this particular category. What it means is, if I use employability as an example, what can often happen is that employers that are happy to work with people who have a criminal record, often they'll have a caveat to that says, but no one with a conviction for a sexual offence.
Any sexual offence and you're barred from being employed by this company.
Yeah, it's therefore by definition not taking into account the specific role, the specific thing that the individual did. It's not taking into account the circumstances around the time passed since the offence. So anything like that where there are blanket bans in place are really challenging and very concerning for us as an organisation, because employability is one common area, but we've seen it in other areas too. So, for example, we've seen advocacy organisations who have a blanket ban on working with anyone with any kind of sexual offence conviction. So preventing people from accessing the support that they really need in order to be able to function in society.
What's interesting is that also extends to social situations. So in the news recently, there was somebody who just got a Labour peerage, Matthew Doyle, and he had been friends with a Scottish politician, and that politician was subsequently convicted twice for accessing indecent images. But then Matthew Doyle appeared to be vilified for keeping in touch with his friend, for phoning him to check on his welfare. So this massive exclusion seems to also extend to the social sphere, whereby somebody, because they know somebody who committed sexual offences, that person has got to be non grata altogether, whatever they did, whatever the circumstances. Belinda, do you think that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely. We find that's the case. The prejudice, discrimination, the barriers all land on the family and friends of someone with a sexual conviction as well. And we see really dreadful cases of this where someone, typically the man in a household, is perhaps investigated and convicted of perhaps downloading of indecent images of children. His home address is published with his full name, with his occupation, regardless of the fact that he will have been bailed to a different address, so he's not even living there, and his partner and their children potentially then become the target of criminal damage, threatening, harassment, bullying. We've had cases where the bricks go through the window, where the children's doing homework. This is what can happen to the people who are family, friends of people with a sexual conviction. It's way out of control, and there really is no need to publish someone's address. We do need to learn from what people have done, and obviously we have some principles of open justice, but when there's such clear misuse and abuse of this information, then it really does call into question the wisdom and ethics and integrity of actually publishing this much information, because you're setting up children and partners to be abused and harassed.
Can I just put the counterpoint of view, which is people might say, well, that person shouldn't have done the offence in the first place, and if their family suffer, it's a deterrent to other people doing the wrong thing.
Yes, except for, of course, it doesn't act as a deterrent. Where people commit an offence, particularly a sexual offence, but others, it's normally when they've shut themselves off from the world, they're trying to cope emotionally with things, there's some stresses and traumas in their lives. So the deterrent effect doesn't work. Do we really think we should take it out on other people?
I think there's a principle that's being missed, which is that as a general principle, we know that when people are well supported, they're less likely to reoffend. The more isolated you are, the more likely you are to reoffend. So by doing things that will exacerbate isolation, the whole premise of that is wrong, because it actually would make someone more likely to reoffend than if they have the support structure around them.
Both of you, do you think this is something that's got worse, this public attitudes? I remember 25 years ago, there were kind of marches on the streets, and there was some, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be comical. Didn't some people actually attack the house of a paediatrician because they got confused with that and paedophile? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Are public attitudes still very hostile? Has there been any change or improvement?
I don't think so. I think they've probably got worse. And what confuses me and partly infuriates me is the hypocrisy. As a female, I would say, without doubt, all of us have suffered some kind of sexual offence. Probably several, from people flashing you, from people trying to touch you up, and to more serious offences. It would be fantastic as a woman to be able to walk your dog at night when it's dark, or to go for a run during the evening or early morning without feeling fear. But we don't. And so for me, there's a real hypocrisy there about what we, as a public, think of someone who's committed a sexual offence, and actually what is deemed to be acceptable behaviour by the average person as well.
From my perspective, I have two views on this, which are opposite to each other. One being that I do think the situation is much worse, and I think that aligns with a political shift in society, the move towards scapegoating. So if you take anti-immigration type protests and then you look at sort of vigilante protests around people who have a conviction for a sexual offence, there's so many parallels between those two things. I think that you couldn't ignore the fact that they connect in some way with that rise of the sort of right-wing rhetoric. And the sensationalist media, of course, feeds into that and exacerbates that. But the other thing that I would say, opposite to that, is that I do think that the very fact that I am the chief exec of a national charity in Scotland and I have a conviction for a sexual offence, that's an unusual position to be in. And I'm not sure that 20 years ago that would have been allowed. And I do think that even the very fact that we're having these conversations, you've chosen to look at sexual offences in your podcast, that in itself means that conversations are being had. And I think that the more conversations that are had and the more people that speak and the more experiences are shared, the more people will actually understand, and it will be more about understanding as opposed to fear.
Yeah, those who commit sexual offences are shunned outside prison. They're also shunned inside prison, aren't they? Eppie, do you think it's worse in prison, or do you think it's just a parallel with society?
I think it aligns with the stigma that exists in society. I do think that, broadly speaking, people who have a conviction, there is a hierarchy within that of offence types. Certainly within a prison setting, you get that, and people with a sexual offence are right at the bottom of that ladder. When you think about identity and you think about how you create your sense of self, a big part of the way that people think about themselves relates to how they think about other people in comparison to themselves. And so I can absolutely see why in situations like in prison where people are being systematically oppressed, I think that it is understandable that people look for someone who's worse than they are, to kind of make themselves feel better.
I mean, what prisons have also offered for people with sexual convictions are treatment programs, psychological programs designed to try and change their behaviour. Do they work, do you think, Belinda?
Yeah, so one of the problems for these psychological interventions is that people rarely commit a further sexual offence when they're released from prison. So you're already looking for a much smaller group of people, and then we're also looking at quite a long time period. So you probably need to follow someone up for about 10, 15 years to actually get a big enough group to say something reasonable about the psychological intervention that happened. But you've also got another factor in the sense of, while you're in prison doing your sort of psychological intervention, help you understand how you ended up in this pathway, you might practice all of these skills and do all this stuff. But what happens when you go out into society who don't want to give you a job, who want to spray paint your house, who want to put bricks through your window, who don't want you to join any group, any committee, have any friends? It's not the same, is it? So part of what really we need to do is to look at not so much psychological interventions, although they can be useful in terms of helping people understand how they came to go down this pathway and to commit this offence, and to take steps to ensure that they don't fall into the same kind of pathway of stress and coping again. But you really need to have a society that also gives people a chance to do something, to get house or car insurance, to get a job, to do something positive in society.
I have to say I'm always surprised when people say that the rate of reoffending amongst people convicted of sexual offences is amongst the lowest. I mean, we've already said it covers such a wide range of activity. Is that true for people who commit the most serious things, or is that a general finding?
Yep, that absolutely holds true. The figures I look at are about 12% of someone ever been convicted of another sexual offence. We know that the vast majority of people who commit sexual offences are ashamed, embarrassed, hate themselves, hate what they've done, and are just desperate to do something good and something positive.
There was a couple of reports in 2025 that looked specifically at people who'd committed the online child sexual abuse type offence. And I think often people have a kind of fear that an online offence would escalate into an in-person offence. But the statistic is closer to 0.5%. So I just think that's quite an interesting statistic when you think about the difference between the public perception and the reality. Just like in Scotland, I work with student social workers, and one of the things that I often ask them is how many people they think are on the sex offenders register. And I ask them how many people they think are monitored at the different levels of severity on the sex offenders register in Scotland. And it always surprises them. The reality is that there are approximately 5,000 people on the sex offenders register in Scotland at the moment. And at the moment, none of them are managed at the highest level of risk. So people, I think, have a perception that everybody in society that's on the sex offenders register are incredibly dangerous and going to harm you in the street and drag you off into a bush. That's not how it plays out in reality. That's not what the evidence demonstrates.
Yeah. I mean, for those who are the highest risk, another approach that's talked about is using drugs to kind of curb sexual desire in some way, so-called chemical castration. I think the government in England and Wales, at any rate, have been talking about extending at least trials of that to make that more widely available. Belinda, what do you think? What's the evidence say about that?
The evidence is very good that the medication, which is administered by a trained psychiatrist who is helping with their problematic sexual arousal. So it's not just sexual arousal, it's problematic. Someone who really feels the urge to have sex or have sexual outlet 6, 7, 8, 10 times a day, every day. This is the levels we're talking about. And that's not something that someone brings upon himself.
It's a medical condition.
Yeah, that's a very good way of describing it, as a medical condition. You know, in many ways you could look at it as a kind of addiction, the same sort of hold and grasp it can have on people. That doesn't take away responsibility for people's actions. It never does. Absolutely not. But it does help us understand the struggles some people have. The medication can help people. It can reduce the sort of screaming of problematic sexual arousal. And one way I like to describe it is, imagine having a radio in your head that was turned up to full volume, which was just shouting sex, 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 sex all the time at you. It'd be very difficult to concentrate on something else. What the medication does, in my opinion, and from our research, is to really turn that volume down. And we see that with that volume turned down, not only are people not seeking out sexual encounters, they can follow the plot of a film, which they might not have been able to do before. Not every encounter with another person is seen as a sexual interaction. Suddenly, their reaction is, oh my goodness, there's a whole world out there. So for many people, it comes as a huge relief. We still, where people have committed an offence, we need them to understand how they got to this place and what their particular challenges or difficulties are. But yes, the medication can really benefit people.
But I think we need to sort of make clear, we're talking about an absolute minority, aren't we, of people who are convicted of sex offences who have this medical condition.
I would say possibly 20-25% of people with a sexual conviction.
I think the other element that's really important to say explicitly is that this is absolutely not something that should ever be implemented in like a mandatory fashion. There are lots of people who would like this, because all of the people that I've ever spoken to who would fit this category of being appropriate for this type of medication, none of them would have wanted to do the thing that they did and would have appreciated being able to prevent that from happening. And so giving people a way of interrupting something before it happens, I think is great. And having the possibility of that is really important, but never in a way that could be forced onto someone without their informed consent.
No, and I think actually that would be quite harmful in the sense of if you're forcing people to take medication, then that brings a whole different mindset to the interaction. So I think that would be a really poor choice, because I think it would take away a lot of the potential benefits.
Okay, we've talked about the barriers, the stigma, the difficulties that people face, and I'm finding that hard to square with the fact that these reconviction rates are so low, because wouldn't logically you would think that the rates would be sky high given this extra stigma and barrier and problems that people are facing? Can you explain how that is?
Because the vast majority of people who commit a sexual offence do not want to have hurt people, do not like the fact that they have harmed people, are very much ashamed and hate themselves for doing it. In fact, they have the same viewpoint as other members of the general public about people who commit a sexual offence and the harm and damage it does, but they have found themselves caught up and going down a pathway, which means they have caused harm. So once they've been brought to account for their actions and they've realised, what they have done, then that is enough for people not to commit a further sexual offence.
Eppie, what do you think? I mean, we've talked about these difficulties that people face. I mean, what are the most important things that people do need to help them move on, not to offend in the future, to get their lives back on track? Are there things that people can do, or is it all a question of people feeling ashamed and they change their ways of their own volition?
There are absolutely things that society can do. I think that if we were in a society that is prepared to look at people on an individual basis, so if people are, for example, able to secure employment, we know that that's a significant factor in an individual's well-being and in reducing their isolation. That if people are allowed and supported to go ahead and have relationships and families and do all of the things that you would expect to be able to do as a fully functioning and contributing member of society, and to be supported as opposed to hated. What we know is that people commit offences when they themselves are struggling, when they are harmed, when they have been the victims of abuse, or if they have addictive patterns of thinking, etc., and they kind of escalate into sexual offences. But I think that whatever we can do to develop a society in which the focus, the emphasis goes on healing people, healing them in their core, then we're in a society where those very low reoffending rates will go even lower. Because to me, it's not actually anything to do with whether people reoffend. It's about the fact that I wouldn't want anyone to offend in the first place. And if we could learn from people who have committed offences, and we can do things like look at medication, and we can look at the way that society currently doesn't allow people to say, I am struggling with this. I've noticed I'm having a problem, for example, with porn and the escalation of porn into illegal material. We don't have accepted avenues for people to ask for help. And yet, if we had all of those things, if we looked at the evidence and we learned from people's lived experience, and if we acted on all of those things, we would have a society that was safer, because we would have a society in which people are less likely to offend in the first place.
Can I ask you, Eppie, about yourself? So you served a sentence and you have moved on in your life, either as part of the sentence or since. What was most important to you in terms of supporting you to not offend again?
There wasn't a kind of risk of reoffending in my case.
It wouldn't be possible because you wouldn't be able to be a teacher again.
I wouldn't be able to teach her, and my particular offence related to the profession. However, the thing that I did was harmful to myself and to other people. And so the key focus for me was looking at why that came about. And there's a very direct correlation in my circumstance that relates to abuse in childhood. So having support and therapy and looking at what caused that to happen in the first place was very important to me. It didn't in any way relate to whether I would reoffend, because that wouldn't be possible. What I could well have done is gone on and had harmful behaviour that would have caused
harmful
harm,
relationships of some kind.
Absolutely, of one kind or another. So that's why the focus for me was on that healing journey.
So the actual criminal sentence and what you did on it didn't actively help your rehabilitation?
No, the particular sentence that I was given...
Which was?
It was a 6-month supervision order. So I had 6 months of having to attend an appointment with a social worker once every few weeks. I mean, it was a very light touch sentence. However, part of it was to have counselling. So I did undertake counselling.
I'll just add in there, at the heart of every sexual offence is an awful lot of harm, but there's the harm that has already happened to the person who commits the offence, as well as the harm they then go on to commit. And if you look at the childhood stresses, the emotional negligence, perhaps physical or sexual abuse, or emotional abuse that someone has suffered, in all my research, I could say you can always unravel how that person ended up with a sexual conviction. I'm not saying it would always go that way, but you can walk back to where it came from. Healing absolutely is the key. And that means healing, obviously, for anyone who's been impacted by sexual offences, but also a hurt person hurts another person. And so that's the cycle we need to really break.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting phenomenon, isn't there, Belinda, whereby people with sexual convictions who deny they actually did hurt anyone, actually their rate of reoffending is often lower than people who do say they did what they did. How does that work?
Can I say something on this one? Just to say that there are people who say that they didn't do it because they didn't do it.
Oh, sure.
It's absolutely essential, though, to acknowledge that, because there are so many circumstances in which people are convicted who did not do it, and they then aren't then overturned as miscarriages of justice. They're just people walking around who didn't do it, and they have a conviction.
No, sure. And obviously, I completely agree that there are lots of people who are convicted of crimes of all kinds who were wrongly convicted. But Belinda, I'm here talking, I think, from research about people who probably did do it, but for their own reasons say they didn't do it. And, you know, instinctively one would think that that is a bad sign, but actually research shows it's not necessarily. Isn't that right?
Yeah, no. And what we're dealing with when we're talking about people who are in complete denial, I didn't do it, I wasn't there, etc. What it does, if you're completely denying this offence, it means your family and friends stay around you and in fact might get quite worked up on your behalf because they're dealing with someone who not only has not committed a sexual offence but who has been wrongly targeted or wrongly accused. Whereas to say, yes, I did it, it means that quite likely for your family and friends to step away and not want contact with you. And we'd find instances where people would be in complete denial to family and friends in the public, but within the prison, they would say, yes, absolutely, I did this, because they were still trying to hold that scaffolding around them to leave them some social support. And the cases where people did come out of that total denial, certainly in my experience, a few cases, the family and friends did just walk away. So it was a kind of almost a reasonable undertaking. That said, also, if you've been in complete denial about something and you come out from prison, then your best way of showing that the courts were wrong is never to commit another offence. You're not that person. So you can see that it kind of becomes a bit protective.
That's incredibly interesting. But sadly, our time is up. I'm certainly glad we did decide to do this podcast after all this time, and we'll probably do another one. We've raised a lot of issues. We end these by asking each of our guests, if you were, in this case, Prime Minister, what one thing would you do to support people who've been convicted of sexual offending to move on in their lives? Belinda, what one thing?
I think I would make it illegal to discriminate against people with a blanket ban of sexual offending. I think every decision about whether people are suitable or not for employment or education or whatever needs to be done on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Eppie, what about you?
I would reform the media. We haven't talked much about it today, but it is significant because it means that it follows you forever and you will never be able to get away from it because people can Google you at any time. So you never have the opportunity to really move forward and take a different path in your life.
Okay, thanks. Penelope, what about you?
I would reform the criminal records regime, certainly in England and Wales, which is what we campaign about. So we run a campaign called Fair Checks. For instance, we would say that short prison sentences should come off records at some point. People move on. And Rob, what about you?
I would talk to the Prisons Minister, Lord Timpson, whose family firm has a great record in giving jobs to people coming out of prison. But people with sexual convictions, I understand, don't get included. And I'd ask him to have a look at that again and see whether at least some people with those kinds of convictions should be considered in the same way as other people.
Great idea, Rob. Thanks, Rob, Eppie and Belinda. And information on both their work is in the programme notes. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.